The best video game console of all time. Now, there's a lofty title, and why are we so obsessed with the best? Well, it's just something we humans do. The best movie of all time, the best musician of all time, the best probiotic yogurt of all time, doesn't matter. We want to declare that things we like are the best. Trying to determine these honors provides intrigue. Imagine if instead of the NBA playoffs, we just said, everybody did a good job. We're done. But when it comes to the greatest game console, one that I hear mentioned a lot is the Super Nintendo, which right away is going to trigger a strong response from those who don't agree. The folks on Team Everything in the Super Nintendo versus Everything battle. And good news, Team Everything isn't just comprised of ragers. You're allowed to respectfully disagree. But if Super Nintendo were to win the battle against Everything, seems fair to me, it should be declared the greatest console. What makes it really difficult to try to say that any one specific console is the greatest ever is that there are so many other different consoles, not just one, so odds are that most people will choose one of the other ones. People develop preferences for different consoles, perhaps based on what they grew up with, and people get attached to these suckers. Take me and my Genesis, for example. Imagine what airport security thought of this. If somebody spends a good number of years with a console and forms a lot of strong connections to that console and its games, yeah, good luck convincing that person that there's a better console out there. Try telling them their grandmammy's apple pie ain't the best while you're at it. I'd like to think I'm a fairly unbiased person to make the argument for Super Nintendo, as I never had one as a kid, but even I have my biases. Everybody does. It's unavoidable. The Super Nintendo facing criticism is unavoidable too. If you think about it from my perspective and all the comments I've read over the years, not to mention the decades worth of forum posts I've read, it's actually pretty ridiculous. If I was convinced by every comment I ever read, there would literally be no video games left for me to think are good, or anything to think is good, period. And like I said, it's fun to make the case for a given console, so let's make a case for the Super Nintendo. Naturally, we can start off with the bangers, what the console is most well known for. The Super Nintendo has a lot of games that you will regularly see people say are their favorite games of all time, or what they deem to be the best game ever made. And sure, every console has games that fall into this category, but I feel like the Super Nintendo's quote-unquote top games have the most ardent fan bases. These are some big hitters. For any game here that somebody might feel the need to say they don't like, the reason why is likely because they've heard tons of people say how much they love that game, which means tons of people love it. But besides the most talked about games, critics of the Super Nintendo like to bring up that there aren't as many great games that people don't talk about as much, to which I say, well, perhaps if they were talked about more, then you would know what they are. You can't judge what you don't know about. You probably haven't tried all the probiotic yogurts yet either, have ya? In the Super Nintendo's favor, it came at a time when Nintendo had pretty strong third-party support. Sega gained a lot of momentum with the Genesis during that generation as far as receiving support from third parties went, but many of these developers, such as Konami and Capcom, didn't abandon Nintendo in order to do so. They still made games for Super Nintendo in addition to Genesis games. And all the biggest developers of the time supported the Super Nintendo. Nintendo, obviously, Squaresoft, Rareware, Konami, Capcom, plus tons of other ones like Natsume, Hudson, Blizzard, LucasArts, Quintet. Furthermore, one of the biggest reasons that other consoles during that generation failed, that is, the ones that tried to get in on the scene, is because they didn't receive enough third-party support and ended up with stuff like the Where Did You Learn to Fly game. The majority of reputable dev teams just stuck with the Super Nintendo and Genesis. That's where the games were. Of course, Sega sure wasn't making games for the Super Nintendo, except for this one. but Nintendo still received plenty of support from everyone else in addition to their own games, resulting in a very rich and dense library of games. And games that arrived during the final generation where games were predominantly 2D, making for timeless pixel art that has both aged beautifully in terms of visuals and gameplay sensibilities, with 2D gameplay offering well-paced and concise gameplay, aka not riding a horse across a landscape for 10 minutes. Again, I'll reiterate, I don't blame the horses themselves, they're beautiful horses. Of course, the debate between 2D and 3D gameplay is an entire video for another day, but I've never been shy about which side I tend to favor, and if somebody does love 2D games, this is a huge plus for the Super Nintendo. Naturally, having bangers from such a large variety of developers meant that we got a nice variety of games as well. As much as the console has developed a reputation for a strong lineup of RPGs, it has much more than that. I find the Super Nintendo's overall library hits the sweet spot between having longer games where you will likely save your progress as you go, and shorter, more arcade-inspired, try-to-beat-it-in-one-sitting games. For every adventure like Legend of Zelda or Super Metroid, there's a Sunset Riders or R-Type 3 to offer quick bursts of fun gameplay. I also like how some of the more traditional genres, like 2D platformers, have received longer games due to the game's ability to save. The Donkey Kong Country series is a good example. It's a bit longer than many of the 2D platformers that came before it, and you can play through the game by breaking it up into multiple play sessions instead of one. Not that I'd know anything about that. As far as the hardware itself goes, I find the Super Nintendo is more than powerful enough to allow for some beautiful looking 2D sprite work, with the one drawback that people point out being the speed of the console's processor. A handful of games were ruined by this. Super R-Type comes to mind, but developers eventually figured out how to better optimize games for the system, and nothing that I would say ruined its best games. Also, people often forget, or perhaps just don't know, that most 2D games during this generation would run at 60 frames per second. Super Nintendo was actually just a smidge over. Wouldn't always stay locked to that frame rate, but I still think it's worth pointing out. Finally, I'd like to talk about the controller, the final piece of the puzzle to having a console with so many great games. Don't mess around with a controversial controller. Dreamcast controller is the ultimate dirty dog in this regard. The Super Nintendo controller introduced the diamond layout with shoulder buttons, which is still used to this day. Pretty much nailed the perfect controller with no gimmicks or funny business involved. The D-pad is great and the ergonomics are fairly solid, making long play sessions no problem. Well done, and while I'd like to give it bonus points for figuring this out all the way back in 1990, it stands on its own as a great controller regardless of time. Also, it's still pretty much the only controller to have alternating concave and convex buttons, which is an understated thing, but it's really nice. Sometimes I like to take one of these out and just rock my thumb back and forth. The next time you only have a few minutes to play games and can't decide, just remember to credit me when you steal my idea. When it comes down to it, I've always thought of the Super Nintendo as the perfect storm. Nintendo still had great support from so many developers, were making awesome games themselves, came at a time when 2D gaming was reaching its pinnacle, and all lived on a console that was pretty solid and well executed, with nothing crazy to ruffle people's feathers, except for the color purple apparently. To be fair, the color purple does prevent some people from even being able to play the console. I've never had a problem with the color purple myself, but just in case I did, look at that and look at me go. But that about does it for my argument of why the Super Nintendo could be considered the best console ever made. If you're curious, my personal favorite console is actually a tie between the Genesis and Super Nintendo, so perhaps a similar video to this one will pop up for the Genesis at some point, Heck, why not for every console? That said, I would love to hear your thoughts on this subject. I'm guessing most people will disagree since, like I said at the beginning, there are too many other great consoles to expect a large number of people to all pick the exact same one. You know how in movies the enemies always wait their turn so they can attack one at a time? Well, Team Everything does not do that in this case. Super Nintendo is essentially getting gang tackled in this battle, but while many of you will disagree with my arguments, I'd also love to hear from the folks who do agree with my points. I'll admit, it's kind of nice when people agree. In fact, in the spirit of that, even though I'm generally not somebody who cares about winning an argument, to stick it to any holdouts, I got one last point to make in the Super Nintendo's favor. You lose. Alright, so leave your comments down below, and I will see ya in the next video.
He's the retro bird, yeah. And he's talking about video games. He's the retro bird, oh yes. And he hopes that you like